Today's class will be analyzing a very interesting poem. That poem is titled The Grieved Lands by Agostinho Neto. The Grieved Lands by Agostinho Neto. During the course of this lesson, we would be learning the background of the poet and the background of the poem. We're also going to be understanding the subject matter of the poem. We're going to be analyzing the poetic devices employed in the poem, as well as Neto's use of imagery and symbolism in the poem. This is Agostinho Neto. This is Agostinho Neto. We're going to be doing a little background on the poet, Agostinho Neto. Agostinho Neto was born September 17, 1922 and died on the 10th of September 1979 in Moscow, Russia. He was a medical doctor by profession, a poet, and a politician. He was the first president of the People's Republic of Angola from 1975 to 1979. He led the popular movement for the liberation of Angola, MPLA, which later won the independence of Angola and dominated the civil war, which lasted for decades. Agostinho Neto is an important person in Angola. Aside being a poet, he was also the first president of Angola and a respected and honored writer and doctor, as well as a politician. Now, let's look at the background and the setting of the poem. Agostinho Neto's poems geared towards national cultural movement, which was aimed at awakening the African self-consciousness. He tried to make indigenous Angolans rediscover their identity and culture, which was to elevate above the non-indigenous white Angolans. He wanted the black Angolans to realize that Angola is their country and they need to rise up and embrace their culture. The poem is set in Africa, said to be aggrieved. As you can see in the background, one would conclude that Africa had been subjected to centuries of different kinds of wars, sorrows, pain, anguish, and turmoil in the hands of the European colonizers. They dealt with Africans in a very strict way and as if they were mere merchandise, usable, expendable, and exportable. Europeans did not see us as important, they saw us as trash. We could be used and dumped whenever we really wanted to. And we made them see us that way. And that's why Agostinho Neto ensured that his poems would revive that culture, would revive that strength, would revive the power of the blacks in their own society. Now, let's look at the poem, The Grieved Lands. The grieved lands of Africa, in the tearful woes of ancient and modern slave, in the degrading sweat of impure dance of the seas, grieved. The grieved lands of Africa, in the infamous sensation of the stunning perfume of the flower, crushed in the forest by the wickedness of iron and fire. The grieved lands of Africa, in the dream soon undone in jingling of jailers' keys, and in the stifled laughter and victorious voice of laments, and in the unconscious brilliance of hidden sensations of the grieved lands of Africa. We'll continue the poem, The Grieved Lands. Alive, in themselves and with us alive, they bubble up in dreams, decked by dances, by baobabs over balances by the antelope. In the perpetual alliance of everything that lives, they shout out the sound of life. Shout it, even the corpses thrown up by the Atlantic, in putrid offering of incoherence and death, and in the clearness of rivers. They live, the grieved lands of Africa, in the harmonious sound of consciences, contained in the honest blood of men, in the strong desire of men, in the sincerity, in the pure and simple rightness of the star's existence. They live, the grieved lands of Africa, because we are living and are imperishable particles of the grieved lands of Africa. That's the poem, The Grieved Lands by Agostinho Neto. We're going to be looking at the subject matter of the poem. The poem mainly focuses on the grieved lands of Africa to remember the very many years of anguish and pain in the hands of colonizers, the Europeans majorly. Africans were majorly colonized by the Europeans. The French came in some parts of the country, but the Europeans colonized Africa, especially the Portuguese. The Portuguese colonized Angola. So they were talking about the tearful woes of ancient and modern slaves. Agostinho Neto, in particular reference to Angola, was also talking about the African countries that were colonized by the Europeans. The poet also makes us see how sorrowful the land called Africa was, as seen in lines 6 to 16, where the poet motif of the grieved lands of African continent suffered from the infamous sensation of the stunning perfume of flower, crushed in the forest by the wickedness of iron and fire. Modernization. They brought modernization, and in bringing modernization, we suffered. How will you bring modernization to a country or to a continent and still make them suffer? Because you came with an aim. You wanted to gain something, and since you hadn't gained that thing, you didn't see the need to struggle hard for it. So we're going to be analyzing it stanza by stanza. Stanza 1. In stanza 1, as seen in the picture, we're going to be looking at the transatlantic slave trade. This was what the poet was trying to make us remember in stanza 1. The transatlantic slave trade, where able-bodied men and women of Africa were torn away from their families and communities and sent across the seas to unknown lands to work on plantations, to become maids, to become mothers to the white people's children, and to suffer, leaving their own children, their own families behind. The poet in the first stanza laments on the tears and sufferings that Africans went through in the period of slavery. Africans went through a lot during slavery. They suffered because they were sold, they were detached from their families, and they were taken to unknown lands where they were starved, they were flogged, they were maltreated, they were treated like animals. Africans were treated like animals. During this transatlantic slave trade, I want you to read about it. You will see where Africans suffered severely in the hands of their colonizers. In stanza 2, we're looking at the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, where the Europeans were coming into an era of Industrial Revolution. They needed more labor, they needed more resources, raw materials, and whatnot. And what better way to get it than to colonize a country and take her resources, including her labor? Is that fair? I don't think so. But that was what they did. They exploited the continent's natural resources. Massive exploitation, like they were just taking it, and not giving anything back in return. They took the raw materials to feed their new factories of mass production, as you can see in the picture. They left lasting negative consequences for Africa, because in taking our raw materials and our resources, nothing was left for us. We were giving them resources, also giving them labor, and we're not getting anything in return. The degradation of Africa's forests and land surface, for example, is captured in a line where the poet speaks of the crushed flower. They took our plants, they took our trees to make timber. They took everything from us. They took everything, including our people. But what did they leave for us? Nothing. Really, really sad. In stanza 3, we're going to be looking at Africa. The poet is taking us back to Africa, where we are lamenting the forcing of the blacks into slavery, which is responsible for the stunted growth of the continent. While colonizing us and they came in, they took our people and made them slaves in their own father's land. Can you imagine? Like taking a brother and making that brother a slave in his own father's land. Pretty disappointing and disheartening. He also stated that many dreams were lost due to slavery and oppression, and Africans are yet to recover from it till now. Yes, so many people's dreams were killed. Imagine a father leaving his son behind. Who will take care of the son? The dreams of that son has been shattered because the breadwinner of the family is no longer available to provide the needs of the family. So you see, everything about their life is in shambles. We see that. Now, in stanza 4, 5, and 6. In stanza 4, 5, and 6, there is optimism in these stanzas. The poet talks about the unrelenting and undying spirit of Africa. Despite everything that happened to them, they had this unrelenting spirit. They pushed to be better. He states that despite being sold to slavery, their dreams still live on. They still believe that someday everything will be better. We also see the living still carrying their dreams, and the natural environment still feels alive. Come to Africa today and you realize that the dreams of the ones that were shipped off into slavery and died there were carried on by the ones still living. You will see everything. The poet speaks of the sound of life that keeps coming from the grieved lands. Despite everything that happened in Africa, we still hear the sound of life coming from the grieved lands. The spirits of African slaves that perished in the Atlantic Ocean on their way to the land of no return have continued to live with the living. So many people were thrown into the Atlantic. So many people were thrown into the Atlantic, as we can see in this particular part of the poem. We will see the grieved lands of Africa and the tearful woes of ancient and modern slaves and the degrading sweat of impure dance of the seas. Grieved. You see that everything, the poet is showing us everything that happened. Even the corpses thrown up by the Atlantic. Even the corpses thrown up by the Atlantic. The poet is showing us that the spirits of the perished slaves will still remain with us and push us to better our country. Their death will not be in vain. To the poet, nothing, not even death, can stop the continent of Africa from marching on to her destiny of triumph. And we can see in stanza 7 a picture of what? Hope. The last stanza of the Grieved Lands of Africa sounds very much like a closing statement. It reaffirms the poet's conviction that the spirit of Africa and her people can never be stopped. There is hope for the continent so long as people continue to have life. That is the poetic and the analysis of the poem, The Grieved Lands by Agostinho Neto. Now, we'll be looking at the poetic devices. The first poetic device we'll be looking at is the language, as usual. The Grieved Lands of Africa was originally written in the Portuguese language and later translated into the English language. Remember, initially I said that the Angolans were colonized by the Portuguese. They were colonized by the Portuguese. So the Grieved Lands of Africa was originally written in the Portuguese language because that was the language the colonizers brought to them. The poet's use of words was carefully crafted to expose how the ancient slavery of Africans and the modern slavery of Africans by Western colonial masters made the black man grieve under unbearable inhuman existence. And then we're going to be looking at the mood and tone of the writer. The mood of the poet can be described as being emotionally grieved about the tearful woes of an ancient and modern slave perpetrated by the wickedness of iron and fire. That is the colonial masters, modernization. So the mood of the writer, we can see that the writer is feeling emotional. He is sad. In the beginning of the poem, we can see the sadness, we can see the grief he is feeling about the way his people are treated. But towards the end of the poem, we can see it. We are feeling a sense of hope coming from the poet, showing us that there is optimism. Africa will be great again. The reader is made to feel Neto's grief about the sordid experience of the black man before and during the period of colonization. Now we'll be looking at the figures of speech in the Grieved Lands by Agostinho Neto. The first figure of speech we're going to be looking at is metaphor, the use of metaphor in the poem. Line 4 of other seas refers to the Westerners, the colonialists, and the imperialists. Line 9, we see crushed in the forest. This refers to the destruction of African culture and innocence. Another figure of speech we're going to be looking at is the use of paradox. Line 14, and in the stifled laughter and victorious voice of laments. Your voice of laments cannot be victorious. You have to be lamenting. And in the stifled laughter, when I'm laughing, I don't hide my laughter. The poet shows how happy the colonialists feel when they jail a nationalist. Another figure of speech is personification. The grieved lands, the title of the poem is personified to cover all the nations of Africa. In line 12, we see by the wickedness of iron and fire, referring to the European powers' domination of Africa. And let's look at other figures of speech. The fourth figure of speech we're going to be looking at is repetition. The grieved lands of Africa is repeated in the first 3 stanzas. And then we have other figures of speech like oxymoron, victorious voice of laments. Victorious voices cannot be lamenting as well, like I said earlier. Evaluation. Comment on the poet's use of diction and imagery in the grieved lands of Africa. How does the poet portray Africa in the poem, The Grieved Lands of Africa? So we've come to the end of our lovely class titled The Grieved Lands by Agostinho Neto. In our next class, we'll be looking at the themes in this lovely poem, The Grieved Lands. Until then, it's bye for now.